Joshua MacFadyen is the ACLC Teaching and Research Team and Canada Research Chair in Geospatial Humanities in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Prince Edward Island, and is also an affiliate Global Future Scholar at Arizona State University. I just received Joshua's new book, Time Flies, A History of Prince Edward Island, from the air in the mail last week, and I'm finding it fascinating. It goes through the history of PEI using old and new aerial photographs. This book approaches PEI from a multi-generational timeline perspective. For example, it talks about the roads, when they were built and why. It goes through the major long-term trends and changes in our primary industries like farming and fisheries. It talks about rural communities and infrastructure, urban development, and coastal change. Goes through big population booms and busts, speculative investing in fox farming, the introduction of the Trans-Canada Highway, the banning of the automobile, and so much more. I would recommend this book to anyone who wants a deeper understanding of why PEI is the way it is. On a personal level, I've known Josh for quite a while through his sister Kathleen, who is married to John McPhee, the singer in my band Paper Lions. We used to visit Josh and Colleen and their 4 kids when we were performing in Kitchener-Waterloo, Ontario. That time was all about fun, music, family, but this is my first time getting to dive into Josh's work as a scholar and apply it to my understanding of PEI and how that might apply to homeowners, realtors, and all residents and visitors to this unique part of the earth. While we're at it, make sure to subscribe to Chattel Fixtures, PEI Real Estate Podcast on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform. And it is my pleasure to welcome Joshua MacFadyen to Chattel Fixtures, PEI Real Estate Podcast. Welcome, Josh.
Thank you, David. Nice to be here.
Yeah. So, getting right into it, this is like, reading this really opened my mind to a longer term view of what is happening and the changes happening in PEI. And so you talked about some massive long-term trends like the types of crops. Based on what you saw, what huge trends are we a part of now? And where do you see PEI going over a multi-decade timeline?
Yeah, thanks. So this book is kind of a bit of everything for everyone. And I'm not your average historian. And you think most people, they're going to write about, kings and queens, politics, or, traditional history. But I was trained as a social historian, trained as someone who takes the local and the individuals just as much kind of importance as rulers and politicians. And so I do kind of the history of a whole place, and when I write history.
Right.
And so when we first met, I don't know if it was first met, but you were hanging out in my basement, sleeping in the house in Kitchener-Waterloo. I was doing my PhD, and I was really focusing on Ontario.
Yeah.
I was working on southwestern Ontario, Western Canada even, but never touched PEI. And when I finally turned back to the Maritimes, and this was because I'd been teaching for a while at Arizona State in person. Now I'm just an affiliate there.
Right.
It was tough. Ontarians know quite a bit about PEI and more all the time as many move here.
Right, yeah.
But in Arizona, nobody even knows where it is. You say, oh yeah, I'm working on, my next project's going to be on Prince Edward Island. And they go, where's that?
Right.
It's in Canada. Oh, like close to Vancouver? No. Different island, different coast. Anyway.
Yeah.
Nova Scotia?
What do you use?
No.
Anne of Green Gables? Did that ever work for you?
That sometimes helps, but
that's
just, it's an imaginary place for them in that way.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So when I turned to PEI, I fortunately got to move back to PEI and
Yeah.
teach at the university here in Charlottetown. So it was great to do this. You mentioned geospatial humanities. That's kind of a made-up concept.
What is that?
Well, I needed to give my Canada Research Chair a title, and they all have to be kind of unique. And so history of agriculture, history of environment, those had been kind of taken, and actually so also had historical geography, which is very close to what I do. So geospatial humanities is because I'm in the Faculty of Arts at UPEI. I teach art students. We look at big questions in the humanities. but I'm a geographer and historical geographer, so I take them into geospatial analysis, and so slam the two together, geospatial humanities. That's what I've got. So PEI in this book is presented geospatially. It's presented through maps, through air photos. Most of the data that I assemble is on kind of where people live, the changes and the trends in how people are living. So you asked about trends. The trends we see here, it's set up in 4 chapters, right? Chapter 1 is agriculture and primary sectors, so fisheries are in there too. Chapter 2 is rural infrastructure. Chapter 1's about what made a living on PEI, then chapter 2 is like what made the island worth living in. It was how did we set up communities, how did we get from place to place, transportation, other infrastructure like that. Chapter 3 is the cities. Urban, it's a focus on urban. And where PEI fits into the kind of larger trends that we see worldwide in an urbanizing world. And PEI just crossed its threshold of going from mostly rural to mostly urban in 2021. That's remarkably late. Yeah. Most people point to 1921 as the moment that Canada went through that transition.
Oh, wow. So 100
PEI
years
has
later.
been rural for a good 100 years after the rest of the country.
Right.
And then the 4th chapter is we're not just uniquely rural, but we're uniquely coastal. So there's no other province that is completely surrounded in coastline.
Right.
So what does that mean for, well, I guess you could say for real estate, but for just residential development and patterns of settlement around this province? And, I use the expression in the book, islanders are moving coastward like the fog, like they are increasingly building along the coast. And so this is part of our shift to a tourism-based economy and a service-based economy. And so it looks at those transitions from primary sector to service and tertiary or tourism based sectors. And with that, where do people want to live? How do they want to live? What's the role of the cities on PEI in that transition? And those are some of the big trends, and I can dive into any one of them if you want.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many things I would love to cover in this. Actually, you open the book with a focus on Crossroads, which is now Stratford, basically, right? The way the old Georgetown Road was built to connect down east, and then when it became the communities down east, then when it became the Trans-Canada Highway, it was more about connecting the country and building tourism infrastructure. So this really nice, well-built highway to Wood Islands, for example. And then, I mean, this kind of this is early in the book you talk about this. Yeah. So it kind of clued me in oh yeah, these roads are there for certain purposes at certain times, and there was some initiative happening. I mean, I guess if you go back further, if you look to Jean-Pierre-Roma in Eastern PEI around Roma Point, Brunel Point, across from Georgetown, it was they had settlements there, and they built all sorts of these old roads, and probably a lot of it was vestigial, growing on top of that, right?
Yeah, and a lot of people don't even know where the Roma settlement is.
Because it's I mean, they have that built up newer historical site there.
Yeah, but it's so remote. Yeah. But for the Acadians, it was obviously he was the first Acadian, and it was a very important place. It was, you could say, the center of PEI for a while, right? The Roma settlement. But they talked about establishing roads from there to St. Peter's Harbor, which was the second kind of most important. It was the most important fishery for the Acadians, and then to Havre St. Pierre. Oh, sorry, Havre St. Pierre is St. Peter's Harbor, and then to Charlottetown or Port La Joie, down the Hillsborough River. And as we say in the book, the rivers were our first roads. That's how people got around. And the book just is transportation from cover to cover, but transportation and housing go kind of hand in hand. Yeah. And so it's from rivers to roads and railroads, and from racetracks to roundabouts. It's how islanders get around. And that's from over a long period of history, but especially over the last 85 years when we have these air photos to look at it. So the Georgetown and Crossroads example is kind of neat, because Georgetown Road actually was never paved all the way to Georgetown, or it was one of the last places to be paved, to receive pavement. It actually went to Montague first. Right. It was first paved all the way to Montague. And then, as I say, it was really the focus becomes Wood Islands for road development, right? So
Yeah.
bringing tourists over the ferry to Charlottetown becomes much more important than bringing anyone to Georgetown. And Georgetown becomes a very, very small town, 500 or less, right? Before long.
Where it is the capital of Kings County.
It is.
And you mentioned in the book, it was the main transportation pathway to Nova Scotia for a while, right?
Yeah, there's a significant ferry.
It had like a deep harbor.
Yeah.
And I knew about there was some boat building, but I didn't even realize that it was.
Yeah, I mean, Georgetown, for all intents and purposes, everybody thought it should be a significant capital and settlement. But actually, not only was it smaller than Montague, but the largest town in Kings County, actually PEI's third town for most of the 19th century, or the 20th century, the 1900s. Most of the 20th century, the third largest town in PEI was Surrey. Until 1961.
Right.
Surrey was larger than Montague or Georgetown. And then Montague and Georgetown together, they become kind of the center of Kings County. But Surrey was actually quite large for a while. So,
and what was that fishery driving that?
Yeah, it was fishery, and there's a really interesting kind of like there's some public investment in Surrey, but it's pretty wild east up there, right?
Yeah,
it's pretty far from the capital.
Even currently, it's like when you're driving up there, depending on the route you take, you're either like you may be going through, say, Farmington, which is like to me, rural PEI, Farmington is
as rural as it gets,
as pretty much as rural as it gets. I mean, there's some other places, arguably, but yeah, to get there. But then when you actually get there, it's
it's lovely.
Yeah.
But for that to have such a nexus, such a draw for people until the 1960s is really says something about the island, right, and the way it's developed. So it wasn't very centralized at first, but over the 20th century, we saw this gravitational pull toward Charlottetown, like that was almost irresistible,
right.
And over time, most of the new development and new building is in the greater Charlottetown area. And even if you remove the kind of the city out of it, the suburbs alone just kind of draw the sort of density of the whole island toward the middle. West Prince remains a significant kind of settled area. But then it does also drop as well. So you see a decline in Surrey, and it doesn't have to be a real decline, but it can be proportional, right?
You mean over the course of, say, the 20th century?
Exactly. From the 1930s to today, you see they don't necessarily shrink, although Georgetown did shrink quite a bit in population.
Right.
But those areas become less significant relative to the total population. As total population grows, it really grows in the Charlottetown area and around Summerside as well. So we're becoming an urban place, and Charlottetown and Summerside are obviously the two main cities. The Georgetown Road question and Crossroads, I use that because I think Crossroads is just this great example, really poignant. It's a crossroads in time, as it were.
Okay, yeah.
But it's also this poignant example of a place that was its own village at one point, had a school, had a midwife, had a church, had a couple churches, had the orphanages nearby, had some prominent farmers,
right.
Had some orchards like the Reeves Orchard, which I show, I think, in the first image.
Right, yeah.
And now that's a subdivision.
Yeah.
I think it's called Reeves subdivision.
Yeah. Reeves Estates, maybe?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
And so that place, in a very short matter of time, can be kind of incorporated into and amalgamated, literally, into Stratford. But it also then becomes a place that you don't recognize as its own village, or even as, nobody kind of knows. Most people don't know where Crossroads is now. It's Stratford.
Yeah.
But when it becomes part of this major growing center, and you have that phenomenon of tourism driving kind of road development from Wood Islands all the way to Charlottetown, it becomes a thoroughfare, right?
Yeah.
And I talk about the road that gets built in 1958 to be part of the Trans-Canada that connects Crossroads with the bridge, right? So the bridge is redeveloped for automobile passage. And in 1958, the writing was on the wall, and they're like, no one's going to take the ferry anymore from Southport to Charlottetown.
Right.
Everyone's going to go by road. And sure enough, they built a brand new road that cuts from the bridge to Crossroads. And if you drive through Stratford today, that is the main road, right? That's the road where development's happening on both sides. I think, though, that it does create an issue. It creates a problem for urban planners,
Right.
which is that it's very difficult now in Stratford to have any sense of a city center.
Well, yeah.
Because you're either on one side of that road or the other.
Yeah.
And because over the last 85 years, we've become a shrine to the automobile, we have become dedicated to, or we've really kind of made automobile transportation more important than anything else, with pavement, our worship of pavement and individual automobility. I don't see that changing anytime soon. So what are we going to? This poses a problem that as we have increasingly kind of important roads and thoroughfares, that we demand better planning and create better ways to have communities that are safe, that are easy to get around, but also where development can happen, and we prioritize community over cars.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because if you I think practically speaking, in terms of, say, cultural center of community, Stratford in a lot of ways is a suburb of Charlottetown, although it has grown dramatically, and you highlight that in the book. But yeah, I guess, I mean, that's one of the big challenges of today. It's like you look at immigration, you look at all these changing forces that are happening right now, and creating a sense of community, and also people for example, even when I was a kid to now, I think there was more, say, the church was a center of community. And not to say that it isn't now, but when I go back to the church that I grew up in Montague, it used to be, there was all these different classrooms of with all the kids that were there, and now more of the people, their kids have moved off to some city somewhere, and they're still there, but it's aging and it's changing, and that sense of community.
There's tons of kind of small villages. In fact, well over 400. There's a map or some data from the 1970s where the census was trying to count how many communities. We have these communities everywhere in PEI. Lots of them remain very important. But ones like Crossroads are now, well, they're part of a big city, a growing city, but they're actually just kind of a place you drive through, or you see it whiz by. You're like, oh, that was Crossroads. Okay.
Yeah.
But at one point they were these standalone communities. They had the churches. They had community like that. And some have disappeared completely. There's places where you'll see a signpost, like Greenvale is one in East Kings I talk about, and Gross Marsh, just past Dundas. There's places like that used to have 10 or 15 homes,
right,
in the 50s and 60s, and there's not a single family there at all. It's potato fields or other kind of.
Well, even if you look at the way, in the book, it highlights the different agriculture at different times, and when you look back to when it was a lot of the crops were to feed livestock, and there was this patchwork of tiny little different kinds of crops and grazing area, and even say Botten Island. There's the photo of the book of Botten Island where it's this patchwork of things, but right now Botten Island itself would be one farm field if they even had it, but you wouldn't. Yeah. But it's just completely empty right now. There are some old wells on it and that kind of thing.
Well, I'm impressed that you even pronounce it correctly, but you're from down east, right?
Yeah, I grew up. Yeah, we'd go out sailing by it and stuff.
You see it written, most people are like Boaten, right? But it's everyone there says Botten Island.
Yeah.
I love that story of Botten Island. And just to plug the website, we're about to launch, and there will be, by the time you watch this, a website at upei.ca/timeflies, all one word.
Okay, we'll put that in the show notes as well, in the video description. You can go under it.
You'll see,
and subscribe while you're there.
You'll see more examples like this from offshore islands. So offshore islands in the coastal zone is chapter 4 in the book, and it has, I think, a side of the island that islanders haven't really thought much about, even though it's essential to. It's one of the gems. One of the great things about living here is our coastal zone. Those offshore islands have gone through dramatic changes. From the 1930s, you go onto those air photos, you'll see farms on every single one of them. From Robinson's Island, which had the Robinson Farm, and others, St. Peter's Island, Olton's Island, in Cascampac area, and Botten Island, as you say, had, I can't remember now, 16 farms, I think. And when they were at their peak with the lobster canneries, there would be hundreds of people working, just a hive of activity.
On Botten Island?
On Botten Island, hundreds.
And how did they get on and off it? Was it connected?
Little boats. So that's a side story.
You can still
there
wade
is a little
through.
spit. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a spit there, and there's a whole environmental history of that that you'll have to read the book to gather that section. But essentially, local fishers got the government to dredge it. So there was a spit that they dredged and made it an island.
Right.
But then over time, it was reconnected by sand, and so you can now walk across.
Yeah.
But over 200 or so years, it's gone from a peninsula to an island to a peninsula to an island. It's ever changing. But the big change is that in the 1970s, there was a report in 1977 that looked at the offshore islands on PEI and said, these are special. These are they're part of what makes PEI unique. And not only are people not wanting to live there, and that's why Bot Island was abandoned before the report in 77. And Alton Island was abandoned before there were attempts to develop it in the 70s. But the islands that were never permanently fixed by bridges. So Lennox gets a bridge, Robinson Islands gets a bridge, and Panmure Island gets a bridge. The ones that didn't completely emptied out of farm settlements. And what happened instead is there was a push for cottage development. So developers tried in multiple places and islands to develop cottages and resorts on these islands. But the report suggested that these islands are the closest thing we have in PEI to wildland.
Right.
We have a total dearth of crown land compared to most provinces.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So we're mostly a privately owned island. So the offshore islands, even though they're not big, they're actually a place where nesting birds and some plant species and tree species can thrive that just can't live in other parts of the island because there's so much development.
Retain that.
So they're almost like
genetic
little
information.
Yeah, exactly. So they become these little reserves, and thanks to some conservation efforts, they were protected. And over the span of the last 50 to 60 years, they've gone from farm settlements to conservation and protected spaces for the ones that weren't bridged, and then some of them today are being returned to Indigenous ownership, which I think is pretty cool.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, wow. We could go deep into that. Okay. Here's a bit of a side, like totally different thing. Okay, let's go back to fox farming.
Sure.
Okay. So I mean, looking at PEI from different perspectives, like there was this wave of fox farming that came in, and there were some people making some pretty big money, and we unlocked essentially the technology to farm foxes, this wild animal.
Yep. In the black
with
fox,
some great
the silver fox,
silver fox, which looks black, right? And we were selling these for big money.
Oh, yeah.
And we kind of had a lock on it because of, the technology or whatever.
Yeah.
But then also this became it was like kind of hot.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
It was like if somebody had maybe say built up some money from some other agriculture business or something like this was like stock investing. This was like speculative investing where people are putting in money and they're hoping to get a really tasty big return on that capital. But then people are also realizing this and kind of shopping it to people, really trying to highlight the potential of this industry. But it didn't, like, the whole thing compared to some of these other, I mean, it wasn't like it was like here and gone in a couple of weeks or something, but like compared to some other industries that have lasted decades on the island, this was not.
It was a flash in the pan.
Kind of a flash
relative
in the pan, to that. Like, because can you maybe, I don't know, talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So the heyday of the fox industry predates the air photo period by just a little bit. So it's 1910s and 20s when it's at its peak. And that's when you get your Robert Olton, who makes so much money in it. Millionaires like Morrison and Milligan, these partners in Northam in Prince County. They do really well. And then you get your $1 million fox trains, and there's never been so much money on a single train being shipped off island, and never will be again. And there were some, as you say, some high rolling moments when the air photos were taken.
We're talking not like thousands of foxes, though. We're talking hundreds of foxes getting shipped away, and this being a huge deal.
Exactly.
Like 500 or 600.
Yeah, just a couple dozen, a few dozen breeding pairs, and going off on a train, and then so that other farms can use those to have their own kits, and
so they're essentially buying a business.
Yeah, exactly. So people would sell a home and buy one single fox pair. in the stories of that in Summerside. Foxes were worth more than your house.
Whoa.
Yeah, in Summerside especially. So, but by the 30s, it's really crashed due to a number of factors, probably over speculation, but there's the change of fashion. In the 1930s, the Great Depression, less purchasing power, and all of that. So whether ordinary farmers made much money on it is definitely doubtful. But what we see in the air photos is that they're really everywhere. If you look at the photo in the book it's an oblique photo, which means it's kind of on a 45-degree angle instead of top down, of Emerald Junction. So that's the junction from there, which originally went to Cape Traverse, not to Borden, but the junction to Cape Traverse shows like a fox farm prominently in the foreground. And then you start looking, they're everywhere. But especially, they're in a lot of fox farms in small towns, but especially in the kind of peri-urban or suburban belt. And one argument I make in here is that in the early 20th century, we didn't have a manufacturing sector. And there's a whole side part of like, why was PEI a have-not province for so long? And that's only just beginning to change and very, very recently. Partly it's because we didn't have a strong manufacturing sector or urban place to have it. But in the cities that we did have it, they were surrounded by fox farms. So in Sherwood, there were several, but the one I focus on, that's by what's now Roper Drive. And it's really between the airport and Roper. And that's like a major fox farm that's now completely treed over. And it's like there's no sign of it today.
Yeah.
But a lot of these places, it was surrounding the suburbs, such as they were in this early period. And that was, in some ways, our manufacturing sector. Like we were growing huge amounts of foxes. Now, this raises a whole kind of animal cruelty, and there were millions of these animals over the whole period,
Really?
Being grown and killed, to send off for pelts. So, and then they were being fed. Interestingly, they're carnivores.
They're carnivores.
Yeah, so they have to be fed essentially dead horse stock.
Horse stock.
It's a little gross.
And some fish.
Some fish, but there was actually a secondary business in supplying the fox feed from dead stock.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. The butchers and abattoirs are like, oh, let's have a little side hustle here with feeding the fox meat.
Right.
So all this to say, you can still see the imprint on the landscape of these places. Now, in most places, like Sherwood has built over those fox farms. Yeah. But if you live in Sherwood, you could be on the old grounds of one of these thousands and thousands of foxes being harvested year after year.
I remember growing up, there was, I grew up on the Robertson Road just outside of Montague at Brudenell. And so there was kind of vestiges of a fox farm. I remember down there, I think it might have been Horry Rourke's place. Like if you came down the Robertson Road, go over where the train tracks were, just on your right in there, I believe, if I recall properly, there was a fox farm in there. When you think about that, like, yeah, that's actually really close to Montague. And you mentioned in the book, like it's usually kind of shaded areas where there's some tree cover and stuff. Why were they so close to town though? Because I imagine, agriculture, I usually imagine it being more rural. But if it's like, is it the combination of they need it to be close or is it the sort of people that live in the community are getting this kind of capital investment, wheeling and dealing? And
it's a mix. You needed some capital. Right, and you needed in some cases the better off farmers were the ones who could experiment with it. Whereas others couldn't get into it. They just didn't have the capital to get into it in your kind of, the small yeoman farmer off in the countryside. But it needed a bit of an urban nexus. It needed some of the services. You just couldn't grow foxes really profitably without a city nearby or a town nearby. But yeah, the forest, this became, you were trying to replicate a forest environment so foxes to live in. So that's why a lot of them, the ones in Sherwood, the ones in Northam, they all had some trees growing around Summerside as well. My favorite though is that if you get the book, the example in Northam is those Milligan and Morrison duo, and they were just millionaires. They had so much money from foxes, and I think from some other investments too. But they built way out in Northam, which is, very remote in Prince County. And they built both the largest dairy barns. They were really getting into dairy. So they would have these huge kind of barn dances.
Right.
But also they had a giant racetrack, and they set this racetrack up. And at one point they had thousands of people out. And it was the first track in Canada, in Eastern Canada, to be lit, like to actually have electrical lighting. So I've got all these stories in the book and online of places that are really remote and really rural, but they're about as industrial and as urban as you could imagine. The money that was flowing through Northam on a night, you can just imagine. And today, from the air, you can still see in the potato fields these imprints of fox pens. And otherwise, without these air photos, I don't think you'd ever see that.
Yeah.
So you'd still see the fingerprints of that industry, even though it's well over 80 years gone.
And this, like, the impermanence of so much of this is part of what struck me going through this, because it makes you realize, when you take things on a multi-generational timeline, in the course of someone's life, an industry being active or something being the way it is. I mean, take Cape Traverse.
Yeah.
Right? Cape Traverse. This was the main conduit of transportation between PEI and New Brunswick for 100 years?
Yeah.
Something like that?
Yeah, well,
maybe 90 years?
Close, maybe at least half a century. Well, no, you're right. Going back to the 1820s and 30s with the ice boats.
With the ice boats. Yeah. And so we're going, we've got this road down to Cape Traverse for people lived and died full, long lives.
Yeah. In a place that we just don't remember or understand.
Yeah. And so there were also, because of that, transportation networks that went down there, because that's where we need to go. And I mean, people doing ice boats and stuff from there too. But for the type of transportation at the time, you didn't need the water to be as deep, right?
Right. You didn't.
So then it comes along, they realize, okay, you know what? Carleton has deeper harbors, still pretty close. We're going to uproot there. People from Cape Traverse move, create Borden, and go. And this new little town is built where where our promises from Confederation are being fulfilled by the feds to have transportation. And meanwhile, this main hub is just kind of like
becomes
but
tiny
those
again.
Roads are still there.
Yeah.
Right. And then so we talked about the way things change. And so roads going through the island, where their original intention, in this case, this is to bridge the gap between PEI and New Brunswick for transportation purposes, infrastructure, things like that. But then people build along these routes.
Yep.
And you call them ribbon developments.
Yeah.
So ribbon developments going down there, and then when that industry, or when that raison d'etre is gone for Cape Traverse, if you look at aerial photos in your book now, there's even more development than at least when those photos were taken.
Yeah.
And people are building up along the coastline and along those routes.
Yep.
And there's, in a way, new life, but it was the original intent is completely different.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes you stop and think, why is this road here next time you're driving somewhere in rural PEI? And there's often a story behind it.
Yeah, but maybe you talk about like ribbon developments, I don't know, like this opened my mind to a whole.
Yeah, I mean, so just to add to what you were saying about total shifts in a landscape over a single generation, like the Crossroads Stratford example, if you look at the book or the online maps, you'll see that as well. In just a generation, Stratford goes from 3 or 4 hamlets at most, tiny crossroads or villages, and now it's one continuous subdivision or city, growing city. And so the air photos help us with that, but they also help us understand these patterns that are much less concentrated. And one of those is ribbon development. It's a big problem. It's where islanders have had kind of total freedom to kind of build wherever they want on the roads and up and down the countryside. And not only islanders, but newcomers too, right? And we get here, people who get here and go, oh, what a beautiful countryside. It's pastoral, it's bucolic, it's pristine. And so why would I live in a subdivision or in a somewhat more sustainable city if I can just live here and have 4 or 5 acres? And so with that pretty well unchecked, we have on PEI this major concern that happens in other places, in especially North America as well. But it's more or less the idea of a road becoming a ribbon, where along it is a string of pearls or so that is a house every few feet or every few 100 yards. And that the book kind of shows that happened most quickly and earliest on places, Surrey West is an example, where the predominant home ownership or land ownership originally was parallel to the road. So you would have one long parcel that kind of went along the road. And so then it became much easier for the owner of that to split it up into multiple subdivisions.
Yeah.
But the trouble is that when those are arterial roads instead of side streets, it becomes very dangerous to live along them. And then when you have 20 to 50 homes in a ribbon along that arterial road, the residents go, hey, we want this to be a slow side street, not a main road. And then everybody else goes, well, we want it to be a main road. And it creates some tension, right?
Right.
And so that happens, interestingly, I think, first in places where property ownership was parallel to the road instead of these. It happened less often in places where the farms were kind of lengthwise perpendicular to the road, if you get what I'm saying. So we can see that in the book.
Wow, so that's just kind of the way they happen to subdivide it early on, and that just changed the nature.
So Kelvin Grove near Kensington is another example that I look at in the book of how ribbon development's happening along a fairly fast, I think it's still 70 kilometers an hour along that road. And no doubt there will be some challenges to that. But I think even in that one photo of Kelvin Grove, you can kind of see sort of everything the book talks about in one series, one photo series. And you see ribbon development, you see urban pressures. Now, Kensington's not a full city, but you do see kind of its expansion and how it's putting some pressure on the land around it. You see the abandonment of you see farm value in those areas going up, but also the tension to sell that to developers, right?
Yeah, of course.
And then you also see in Kensington, in that same series, you see some forest being cleared.
Yeah.
And then you also see, just at the top right, you see the hog public forest, which is actually preserved. So, I mean, I'm not saying it's like right or wrong. I'm just saying that islanders, if we better understand how landscape change happens and how bigger changes like transportation changes and economic transitions and energy transitions occur, it helps us understand from a long run perspective how history works, at least in Prince Edward Island and in Canada. And I think then it follows from that we should demand better planning, demand that our governments do more.
Like just forethought and thinking.
Yeah, just get involved, right? Like don't sit by and say, I'm complaining about the way things are in rural or urban PEI, but learn about it. Books like this can help, but learn about it and then get involved. We want some land to be saved for wildland. We see that in the offshore islands. That was a success. We actually also see in the book our streams and riparian zones get a lot greener, and that's explained through chapter 1. This process of intensification of agriculture. So we see some areas improve and others kind of get threatened in ways that I think the ribbon development is something we really got to hold in check, or it's just going to be, the island will be from tip to tip, or at least the central part of it.
Everywhere you go, there'll be cars coming.
Yeah, and we'll have, our roads won't work for us anymore.
Right.
And we'll have just kind of, instead of any kind of centralized community, we'll have people living in all directions and demanding the same kind of municipal services that you get in a city.
Right. Okay. Yeah. That's interesting.
Right.
Yeah. Just in terms of the practical, how to make that work practically. Yeah. There's
but it's ultra low density, right? Ultra low density.
Ultra low density.
Yeah.
Right. No, that's a good point. And there's a few things like pinging in my brain from what you just said. One is just, again, back to that crossroads development and the way that the old Georgetown Road, the lower one is the old Georgetown Road, and then Trans-Canada is the Georgetown Road or New Georgetown Road.
Yeah.
But the way the old Georgetown Road, when that was no longer as sort of important from a connection standpoint, ribbon development all along through, say, Kepik out into Pownal, all along that. But then if you look at the way that Kepik and that part of, like, from Southport down in Stratford has developed, and all these subdivisions in around there, well, that no longer is kind of a main thoroughfare. So in a way, the ribbon development was kind of like a sort of a natural process of taking what was almost vestigial like roadway in terms of it being important for connecting the other area and it transitioning into an urban area.
Yeah, and it still kind of poses the issue of like, why have so much development there as opposed to kind of bringing it a little closer. And the other thing is that it's a threat to our farmland as well.
Well, yeah.
And we're seeing our farmland drop pretty dramatically in the early 20th century. That's for a variety of reasons. Sometimes we do more with less, right?
Like early 21st century?
Sorry, 21st century,
right,
yeah. So some have said a 20% drop in farmland, which is
That's
significant.
Over the last couple decades?
Yeah, in 2 decades.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is
in some ways we're doing more with less, but farmland is a finite resource. And so some groups like PEI Federation of Agriculture have argued that, it should be classified as a resource, not as just, as just ordinary rural land.
Oh, there's so much to that conversation because just in the way that, governments are planning this and because there's also the counterbalance of that versus we don't have enough housing and then how to do that in a smart, effective way while also not just getting totally trapped in the, just purely a central planning type of process in a way too, because sometimes when you just have a few, maybe brilliant people working on it versus sort of the whole market trying to think about how to solve it, there's all these different conflicting forces that can
and that tension has been, ongoing for decades, centuries even. And like I say, I don't think either side is the answer on its own.
Right.
But an answer is for the public to get informed and to be part of the solution.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, so also the other thing that pinged from that, what you were talking about, was this idea of, thinking about the future and what, thinking ahead to the future and what it means for PEI. And then you think about how we adapt to the future and you think about cars being banned. Yeah. Okay, so this, I don't know if I never heard about this or forgot about it, but when I stumbled upon this in your book, I was a little taken aback. This was, I forget when it was, let's say, 1908 or something like that. Especially people in rural PEI.
Yes.
We saw, it's like these horses, they could go through paths in the woods. They could, if the road was soft, the horses could kind of get around. These cars, they were racing around on these roads that were not purpose built for cars. And there's children going around. There's horses and livestock going around that could get hit by these, machines going through. It's like people are like, whoa. These things are nuts. We don't need them. Let's ban them. Actually goes ahead, bans automobiles.
Yeah, the only province
banned automobiles.
The only province to completely ban automobiles. There had been restrictions elsewhere, but
and it was like 11 or 12 years before that was completely gone, right?
Broadly, though, what it shows is the power of the rural bloc, right? The power of the rural vote and the rural voice. That just isn't there anymore because, at that point we had 14,000 farmers on PEI. Now we have 1,900. We have less than 2,000 farmers now, but we still have a lot of rural residents.
But I mean, cars are certainly helpful for farmers now.
Absolutely. But at that time, it was this sense that why would rural people buy something like that? That was an urban thing to do.
Right, but I'm also just thinking ahead to the future here. It's like, okay, what is bound to happen? Yeah. Well, one thing that I think is going to happen, maybe not, I used to be more optimistic in terms of, thinking a bit positively about self-driving cars. And I've gotten more, and my put out, I think it's inevitable. But whether this happens in the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, where it's actually, these are just dominant forms of transportation. But this is self-driving cars are something that is and will be controversial because even if they're 10 or 100 times safer than a human driving a car, when that self-driving car hits and kills someone, that is really bad PR, right? And so I was thinking about that and thinking like, well, are there jurisdictions going to ban it, things like that? And then you look back in history to what happened when we banned the automobile. Over time, it became obvious that this was actually, in fact, very useful technology. Yeah. And so you see kind of the sea change, the tides of change coming, the resistance to some of those tides of change coming,
Yep.
and then you see the gradual acceptance of those tides of change.
Yeah.
And I mean, PEI doesn't always have a reputation for being on the cutting edge with these sorts of things. I'm not sure where I'm taking this as a question, but what's your reaction to that?
A couple of things. The fact is that history is, of course, not inevitable, and we see how some of these changes we just can barely imagine. So I keep coming back to like the shrine of the automobile. The cities, even in this early period, even though they were interested in driving, it was mostly as a leisure thing. Charlottetown was ultimately small, dense, and walkable. Right? People could get around by foot. In fact, they had to get around by foot or by horse, and transportation was, by necessity, a little bit more active. Active transportation was alive and well. And actually, even when the first bylaws were passed in Charlottetown, there was, out of 11 bylaws, I think 8 limited the automobile and prioritized the pedestrian. And there was, so you must there were bylaws about the use of the automobile. You have to have lamps, use horn signals, notify pedestrians. And then there was even other regulations on cycling, hauling, parking, cattle driving, sledding, skating, and playing, saying all of those things must not impede the pedestrian, what it called the foot passengers of the city.
Passengers of the city, yeah.
And now our cities are truly shrines to the automobile. People commute 5 blocks away and won't walk it.
Oh yeah.
And then demand the parking when we get there.
I drove to Stearns to pick this up.
Way down there. That's a long way. Cold day.
How's it around?
But so we need to plan for plan for technology transfers and changes like this. But we just need to know. First need to think about what's best for us as humans, as communities, and then say what technologies do we want that serve us, rather than saying, well, cars are great, so how do we make everything
about cars?
Yeah,
and then
infrastructure
throw the baby out with the bathwater. Yeah. It's yeah, and you can see it. I mean, this goes back to your idea of the Trans-Canada Highway going right through Stratford and affecting. I don't know how that, adjustment in history. Maybe it could have curved up a bit, went a bit more up around Mermaid and then down and across or something like that to have that work together. But then, I mean, if you look in the book here, one of the big things that I think some of the most stark changes in the aerial photographs are in urban centers. And as compared to almost anything else in the book, yes, Summerside, big changes, Montague, big changes, but Charlottetown and say around Capitol Drive, that was all farmland around there. If you look up around kind of where the airport is and where that formed, or the university, it's just there in farmland, right? All the area around it, it was just farmland. But maybe nothing more stark than, and you mentioned this early in the conversation, Stratford. After the Hillsborough Bridge came in, that is mind-blowing seeing the photos of that then and the photos of that now. I mean, I'm not exactly sure where I'm taking this question, but did you expect to see such contrasting images when you put this together? And what did you learn from that part of it? Because like going through the book, that was maybe some of the most sort of jaw-dropping changes, most noticeable changes.
Well, what you see is that in the post-war period, everybody wanted a car. Pavement was relatively easy to produce. It was a very successful technology. Roads were much improved. They were cleared of snow in the winter, and you could more easily get around a much longer distance. Tourism was actually driving this as well, because we wanted our tourists to be able to drive on paved roads to Cavendish across the island, right? And to get into Charlottetown. So even in cities, you see this. This is kind of, none of these patterns are truly unique to PEI. But PEI shows them, I think, in really interesting ways through the air photos. You see in PEI, the cities actually hollow out. They the actual population drops in Charlottetown and Summerside in the early post-war, even during the war.
Right.
And that's because people want that larger space. They want a larger home to raise and grow. This is a baby boom period. They wanted to raise larger families, and they were just going to move just outside city limits on good roads, and raise those families in these growing suburbs. So the suburbs had not yet been incorporated or amalgamated with the city. So Parkdale was separate until 1995, actually.
Parkdale was separate until 1995.
Yeah,
Oh, right,
and so was
yeah.
Sherwood.
Yeah.
West Royalty, I don't know if it was even separate at that point, but the whole North River Road area. These places were where people were moving. So people were leaving the sort of city itself. Population was declining, and then you see the whole thing begin to grow later in the 70s and 80s, but after amalgamation, the numbers fly up because now it's the greater Charlottetown area.
Right.
So this is what you see in the air photos. And I wouldn't say it's a surprise to me, but it's pretty dramatic. And I think what it shows us is that these are very, very important spaces for us. Let's make them good places to live. Let's make higher density, but smart density, and make the city like active transportation needs to be available with all new developments. We need to think of the risks of climate change. We need to think of just equitable places to live as we transform these spaces. Because once the infrastructure is in, it's very hard to kind of change course.
Right.
20, 30 years from now. So think forward, right?
Thinking forward. Okay. So say the latest or the most recent that I'm aware of from the book and through my work as a realtor, like we use the 2020 ortho photos from GeoLink all the time on a daily. We're on there. But looking at those 2020 images, and if we look ahead to 2070 images, what do you think the biggest changes? We're going out far. It's really hard to predict what's actually going to happen with something like this.
Yeah.
But if you had a crystal ball right now, based on the huge, massive trends that we're seeing, and maybe changes in trends that you're seeing, maybe what do you expect to see the biggest changes in that 2020 to 2070, or maybe what would you like to be the biggest changes in 2020 to 2070? That's 50 years. I mean, that seems like an appropriate time scale to ask a question related to this book. Yeah. What do you think? Where's your head go with that?
I think probably each I would have a different answer for each one of the 4 chapters, right? But
maybe let's go with agriculture
Yep.
and where people live, that kind of stuff. Just because.
Well,
I mean, anywhere you want.
I'll do 2 then. With agriculture, I would and with fisheries as well. Aquaculture. I'd like to see us all being willing to pay a little bit more for food. Now, I hate to be the guy that says raise the price of food because it hurts already, right? But we are paying for cheap food that's imported from vast and far areas, and as a result, we're not really kind of properly remunerating farmers, I think, for what they can do here on PEI. So a shift in the food system wouldn't necessarily require more farmland, but protecting what we have and producing better food and empowering farmers to do that.
And how would that look different in 2070 from aerial footage?
I'll leave that for volume 2.
Okay.
But yeah, on the air photos, just more productive land, more productive agriculture and aquaculture. That's protects the environment, and really kind of that gets passed along to consumers. Like we reap the benefits of it, but we also pay a little bit more for it.
What are we paying? What are we buying? Are we buying more
more fresh food, like, things that are good for us, less processed food.
So like more permaculture, or like more.
I mean, permaculture's got a lot going for it, but it's much less productive per acre, right?
I mean, when you think of one of the beautiful things about potatoes, one of the things I love about potatoes, potatoes don't always get the best rep. And then kind of like when you talk in this book about, the introduction of crop rotations and it being every few years, the just sheer amount of calories, you talk about this in the book, you can get per acre with potato. It's incredible.
Yes. And it demands enormous inputs, right? Very costly, and it requires a lot of both fertilizers and pesticides and fungicides. And those those all have costs that aren't really being factored in,
Mm-hmm.
right? The externalities of agriculture. And so it is very, very kind of high output, but we also have the ability on PEI, and we were doing it for centuries, to grow, fodders and legumes and crops like that. There are people here. There are people here who raise livestock that say they don't actually, raise sheep. They raise grass. The
Right.
sheep are just a conduit or a converter for turning that into useful products
Useful
for people.
food, yeah.
So that's a much longer conversation, I think. But the housing side of things, I will resist prognostication as
Yeah.
much as possible. But I think our coastline is a very special place, and our coastal views and our rural views are very special places. I think building in and close to them and within view of them is something that's going to continue.
Mm-hmm.
But also, I hope we can continue this process of preserving places like the offshore islands, like the coastal zone, the immediate places. And the more we see climate change, like Hurricane Fiona and other storms, and just general erosion impact our coastal zone, I think we'd be foolish to get any closer than we already are.
Right.
So a little bit more control, but also still recognizing that that's a value. That's a really special, valuable
people want to
part.
be able to look out the window and,
Yep.
and see the water and
Yeah,
walk down.
and they will
That's
continue to.
a
That's
lot of why people want to be here.
Yeah, it's one of the things that's making PEI just increasingly attractive to people from around the world, across Canada. We're seeing this for the first time. They are. Next time you're stuck in a traffic jam, think, man, it's great to be on PEI. Never been a better time to live here.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's getting a little easier to get around with the roundabouts and stuff. Is there any other topics you want to go? I mean, I had a list of questions and I've only just sort of glanced at it here and there, but
well, maybe check out the website and maybe I'll come in for part 2. And
yeah, I mean, there's so much to talk about. Absolutely. What is the best way for people to get a hold of you and to find your research? You mentioned the website, maybe mention one more
so
time.
the book sold out its first printing just before Christmas, which was great, but I understand there's another few hundred copies arriving in the bookstores. Bookmark, Nimbus is the distributor, so you can visit their website, or Indigo. I think Indigo's website is a good place to order it.
Can you pre-order the next
I don't know that
printing?
actually. I think on Indigo you must be able to.
Yeah, okay.
Certainly with you can. Nimbus is great too. You can send them an email.
It looks like this. Yeah, absolutely. It looks like this. Yeah, that's great. I mean, thank you so much for coming on and talking. I would absolutely love to do a part 2 at some point because there's just so much to get into here. And I mean, just to talk about the book for one more minute, I mean, as a realtor, I do kind of feel like this is maybe not, like I could get away as a realtor without reading this book for sure, but just learning this about all these other different parts of the island, I would recommend it to the other realtors viewing this as just a way to kind of get a bit of a deeper understanding of why things are the way they are, or anybody here. So it's really dense, I did find, in that it takes a while to get through because I mean, it's academic writing, but it reads really well though. Thanks. So not to get too review.
Well, I appreciate it, and I'll plug. I am giving a talk on the 23rd, a Tuesday, at 23rd of January at Island Studies Lecture Series, which is in University of Prince Edward Island's main building at 7 p.m.
Great. Is that going to be webcast or anything?
I think
like
it
that?
will. Yeah.
Okay, so
definitely
people are watching this in 2070, looking back on whether or not any of the predictions came true, then they can go back and maybe find that talk too.
Well, I appreciate you having me on for this discussion.
Yeah, awesome.
Thanks, Steve.